question I asked is, why is it so important for us to always have these in our blood? Oxygen and glucose. And I heard some answers, but say it again, I wasn't paying attention.
They're needed to form ATP.
ATP?
The fuel.
How many say that? You all took biology 103 and 201? So what did you learn about oxygen and glucose?
Was it respiration? No.
Well, we'll get to that too. So before we even go there, how does oxygen get into the blood? When we inhale, right?
Yeah, inhale.
So when we inhale, oxygen comes into the lungs and then gets into the blood. Okay? How does glucose get in the blood?
Sugar and starches that we eat.
So, food, right? So when we eat a meal, there's probably carbs in it somewhere. And carbs, polysaccharides, disaccharides are broken down to glucose, and glucose goes directly into the bloodstream from the digestive tract, okay? Now, I don't want you all to leave this class without being able to tell your future instructors why we have oxygen and need oxygen and glucose in the blood at all times. And the answer, somebody said something about ATP. Nobody agree with her? It sounds right. Let me ask you this. What do you know about ATP?
It's made in the mitochondria.
ATP is made in the mitochondria.
And it's 32, I think 32 ATP.
It's needed for metabolic functions.
So our cells make ATP from these two. Okay? ATP is important because our cells can't do anything without it. Any activity, just like your car cannot move unless what?
Oil in it.
It has gas in it, and oil. Okay, that's the energy source. So anything that has to do any movement or any activity must have some energy source. So our cells, the living cells of all living things, the energy source is ATP. Okay, so every cell of your body must have a constant supply of oxygen and glucose, or those cells will die. Okay, so think for a second of all the things that interruption of blood flow can do to different body parts. So if your blood flow stops going to your big toe is going to what? Fall off. It's going to die. If your heart, coronary arteries, you all know what those are now, right? What they do. Yeah, we'll get to that in the next chapter. The coronary arteries supply the heart muscle
With the oxygen
and glucose. So if those coronary arteries are blocked, the heart muscle can't get oxygen and glucose. So the heart what? Stops beating. So any cell of your body, you just name one, if it is not receiving oxygen and glucose, the cells are going to die. Okay? And that is because the cells have to continuously make ATP or they stop functioning. All right, so that's the overall. And I'll come back to that several times. You all need to understand that. Try not to just memorize so much. Okay, and where do we say the oxygen comes from to get in the blood?
You said the oxygen breathe.
Right, how does oxygen get in the blood? Right, so when you inhale, oxygen comes into your lungs, and then it diffuses from the lungs into the blood. And when you exhale,
the CO2 from the blood goes into the lungs.
There you go. So you exhale CO2. Where does the CO2 come from?
outside. No, it comes from the blood.
The CO2. That's like exhaling is like cleaning out the blood from the toxins, and inhaling is like accepting the oxygen for the blood to feed the organs, or something like that. I'm kind of
CO2 is the waste.
right there.
Huh?
CO2 is the waste.
CO2 is the waste.
That's what I
But
meant.
where does it come from?
Right, coming out.
Waste from where?
Deoxygenated blood.
The capillaries, yeah. Right.
And we'll get to that. We'll see that
You gotta be coming from the oxygen.
in arteries and veins. Most arteries and veins, there's a difference in whether they have CO2 and O2, right?
Capillaries, yeah.
So you all know where oxygen comes from when we inhale. You need to know how CO2 gets in the blood. Also, from this same reaction. So the reaction that O2 combines with glucose to form ATPs, those 36 ATPs. During that same process, CO2 is produced in the cells.
Okay.
So you have to get rid of it. So the cells are constantly bringing in oxygen, and those same cells are getting rid of CO2 immediately. So it's a gas exchange process. When the cells finish making the CO2 is sent from the cell into the blood, and at the same time, the cell is going to pick up oxygen. So when we see gas exchange, that's what's going on at the tissue cells and tissue layer. All right, that's kind of an overview. You'll see the systems named either circulatory or cardiovascular. There are slight differences in the two. Specifically, circulatory is referring to the heart, blood vessels, and blood, whereas cardiovascular system is more specifically referring to what? The heart and blood vessels. The word cardi is heart, vascular is blood vessel, right. So the heart and blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system, but most of the time you'll see them used interchangeably. Hematology is the study of blood, and that's what your case study is today for lab, a hematology case study. Functions of circulatory system, so there are several. The primary function, though, is transport. What's being transported? You all just told me oxygen, which comes from where?
Inhale.
When we inhale, right? CO2,
Waste.
which comes from, it's a metabolic waste. In fact, when you all hear about metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, the metabolic is referring to the buildup of CO2. So if we're not exhaling fast enough, CO2 builds up in the blood, causing the blood to be acidic. So that's the metabolic part, coming from the breakdown of glucose to form ATP in the cells. But we'll get to that later. Nutrients are transported, waste, and hormones are also transported. Blood also serves a protective function, actually a couple. One, it limits the spread of infection, destroys microorganisms. So what parts of blood prevents the spread of infection and destroys microorganisms? Leukocytes, right. White blood cells, lymphocytes are one type. Also, white blood cells can destroy cancer cells as well. Initiates clotting. So blood clots, how is that protecting us from blood clots?
We won't stop. Like blockage, blood flow.
It prevents you from hemorrhaging.
Right. So it prevents you from bleeding to death just by a break of a blood vessel. Blood would continuously leak out if it were not for these blood clots. So that's necessary. But blood clots can be bad, I thought.
They can. Some of them can.
So we need them, but they can be bad for us.
Like everything else.
Just like everything else. Okay, and we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter also. Bad blood clots. And then regulation. The circulatory system regulates fluid balance, stabilizes pH of the extracellular fluid, as well as temperature control. And you all may remember what does blood have to do with body temperature control?
If you're cold, it comes up to make blood flow faster.
Something like that. So remember, when if you're, let's say it's 110 degrees outside and you're outside for 30 minutes, happening to your body. Your body temperature is trying to increase, right? But we have a mechanism to reduce it when it tries to go too high.
That's sweating.
Right. So sweating is one mechanism to control body temperature. But also, when you're outside and it's very hot, your blood vessels do something also. So if it's very hot outside, they dilate. And what that does is allows heat. Blood carries heat. It allows heat to dissipate into the atmosphere. Okay? And you can remember that, especially fair-skinned people, if it's really hot outside, your skin turns what?
Red.
Red. And that's because the blood vessels are dilated and the heat is being released there. Whereas if it's 10 below zero,
I turn red too.
if it's 10 below zero, I never turn red. If it's 10 below zero, what happens to your blood vessels then? They constrict. Why? To hold heat inside the body. So if it's very cold, you don't want to release heat from your body. You want to hold on to it. And we'll get into the stabilization of pH, acidity, and also fluid balance in later chapters. All right, transportation. So we already went through these. So blood transports oxygen to tissues. Oxygen comes from where?
The red blood.
Inhaling.
From the lungs when we inhale. So the whole purpose of our lungs then, we'll get to the respiratory system shortly, but you'll know already. The only purpose for lungs are to bring oxygen into the blood and get rid of CO2 from the blood.
CO2.
That's it. Okay? So once oxygen gets into the blood, where is it supposed to go next? Or ultimately?
It distributes to the tissues, right?
To the tissues, right. I'm just trying to see if you all are getting it all.
We getting points for
I don't know about everybody, but us three,
You should on the test.
We getting points for this.
Yes, you should on the test.
Look, we got this right here.
Okay?
I caught that, doctor.
So oxygen comes into the blood for one purpose and one purpose only. To what? Be distributed to
The organs, tissues.
the tissues, the cells of the body, so they survive. Okay? And then CO2 comes from those same tissues of the body and is released from our lungs on out when we exhale. Transport of nutrients and other substances. Transport of waste products from cells, and carries hormones to organs. So we remember the hormones. Regulation. So blood buffers help to keep the pH of the body fluids between 7.35 and 7.45. So this is the normal range of blood pH. Substances. Remember what buffers are?
They maintain that.
Right, they resist pH changes, and those are important. Substances maintain osmotic pressure to regulate fluid in tissues. Oops, I went too far. And transports heat generated in muscles. So that's all redundant. Protection, yeah, we mentioned all this. All right, a few of the components. So what do we find as the major components of blood? We know there are things dissolved in it, but the major components of blood are plasma, as was just mentioned. And plasma is the extracellular material or matrix of blood. And so plasma is a matrix of blood, but you also find the formed elements. So you all need to know what those are. So the major components of blood are plasma and formed elements. Plasma and formed elements. Okay, so plasma is the liquid matrix of blood. Remember what type of tissue blood is? What type of tissue? Right, so it's a connective tissue, and it's the circulating type of connective tissue. Right. And so all tissues are made up of what? Tissues are made up of cells. Right, cells and cell products. So the cells are the formed elements of blood, and the extracellular material is the matrix of blood. Adults have roughly 4 to 6 liters of blood. And what are the formed elements? So the formed elements are the cells, and there are how many types of cells in blood? 3 types. You have red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes, white blood cells, which are called leukocytes, and platelets, which are called thrombocytes. Thrombocytes are platelets. And we'll see the function of those, of each of those. The 7 kinds of formed elements. So you have red blood cells, only 1 type. White blood cells, there are 5 types. So we have 5 types of leukocytes, and they're categorized by their appearance. Granulocytes appear to have granules within the cytoplasm, and those types are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Agranulocytes, meaning without granules, are the lymphocytes and monocytes. So 5 types of white blood cells, 1 type of red blood cell, and then platelets again are thrombocytes. And these are the appearance of those, some of the differences. All right, hematocrit. So of the components of blood, give me those components again. Plasma and informed elements. Right, plasma informed elements. So what if you wanted to get a person's blood, and all you want though is their cells? You don't want the plasma. How do you separate them? By centrifuge, right? So that's what's shown here. This is a centrifuge, a little machine. Yes, that's what a centrifuge is. So you put the blood in the tube, put the tube in the centrifuge, and there are wells that kind of, the tube goes in at an angle like this, so when it spins very rapidly, everything heavy goes to the bottom. So in whole blood, the heaviest part of the blood are the red blood cells.
Okay.
So the red blood cells end up sinking to the bottom of the tube. And if you just want plasma, you can get that off the top.
How do they do it when you give blood? Because they don't have a machine that separates.